This is my 96th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge, and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is in the nature of a progress report on the shelf layout that I'm building. The main focus here will be on laying flex track and installing point motors and wiring, as that's where most of my effort has been going, and frankly a lot of effort it has been too. In my last video I built the Hornby station terminus and placed it at one end of my shelf layout. I said at the end of that video that I might next build the Superquick card kit for a terminus station building, which I'm planning to use for the station at the other end of the layout, or I might just make a template to get the layout of that building and go on to track laying. Well, I went with the latter approach. I haven't even unpacked the Superquick terminus station building kit, but I did make a template for it by taking a layout diagram I managed to find online and scaling it so that it would print out pretty close to the size of the actual building. And you can see that template at the right here. There will be no problem with the building fitting at that end of the layout. Where it seemed that there was a potential problem was that the space allowed for the tracks by the Superquick building was much narrower than the space normally used by Hornby double tracks. The Superquick kit allows 90mm for the tracks, whereas the Hornby terminus station leaves about 125mm. I was quite concerned about this and wanted to determine whether it would be possible to install platforms and tracks to fit with the Superquick building and still be able to run trains okay. To check this, I installed platforms with the Superquick template using Hornby plastic platform pieces and then laid 2 tracks between those platforms. I then tested rolling stock on those tracks for clearance from the stock on the other track and from the platform edges. It appeared that with careful adjustment this setup should be fine. It should be possible to draw passenger trains in and out with the coaches nicely aligned with the platforms. It really helps, of course, that no curves are involved. Trains will only be pulling straight into this station, so there's no need to worry about the way coaches overhang from the track on curves. In fact, this spacing is actually much closer to realistic than the default Hornby spacing, but realistic spacing isn't possible when coaches will be coming into platforms on a curve. Another potential issue with the modified spacing was with respect to platform roofs. The Hornby platform roofs are designed so that the bases of their support pillars plug into holes in the centre of the platforms. But with the roofs plugged into the platforms like that, they force the default Hornby spacing of the platforms, which wouldn't fit with the Superquick building. I tried Hornby roofs on the platforms with the narrower spacing. The roof pillars came right at the outside edges of the platforms, so the Hornby roofs could be used, but I'll need to either make new holes for the pillar bases at the edges of the platforms or just cut off the pins at the bases of the pillars and have them sit flat on the platforms. They could be glued, but they'd probably be okay without. Around this point I realized that I'd been making my platforms shorter than on my original layout plans. Platform length is another of those perennial problems of railway modelling, along with the tightness of curves, all related to the basic lack of realistic space. It's pretty much impossible to have platforms on a small domestic layout of a length that would be realistic for anything except a very small branch line halt. I lean towards compromising with slightly larger platforms, even if this means that the stations take up an unreasonable amount of the layout space. So I wanted to make the platforms on my shelf layout plenty long enough to hold 2 coach trains and just about manageable with 3 coach trains. For that I needed 5 Hornby straight sections per platform, and I had bought enough platform sections for this. Here I've expanded the far station platforms to that length. And here's the Hornby station at the near end with the platforms expanded to that length. This now means that I've added 6 straight platform sections to what came with the original Hornby Terminus station kit. To start with laying actual track, given that the station layouts were now in place, the curves on the corner were the critical point. I did these with Hornby set track, 2nd, 3rd and 4th radius curves. It was a bit of a squeeze, but I figured I could just about fit all of the curves on the shelf width that I had. For the rest of the track I was using flex track. Although I wasn't using flex track for any major curves, it allowed me more flexibility with slight deviations in my straight tracks and allowed for custom lengthing of pieces. Flex track, however, is for my money a royal pain in the behind to work with. It's not that difficult to cut it to length. My preferred method is to use a cutting disc on a rotary tool to cut through the tracks. As if done carefully, this leaves neater ends than using snippers. But then you've got to join up the tracks, and this is always a pain with flex track. Fitting rail joiners at all is awkward, and when you do have fish plates on the rails, it's still hard to get the pieces of track to join up properly due to the way the rails slide in the sleepers. Anyway, the method I've come up with for fitting fish plates to flex track is to use my hot knife to cut under both rails at the end, removing the chairs and leaving a gap under the rails. This is definitely easier to do with a hot knife, which melts the plastic as it goes. The results may look a bit messy up close, but it does allow for fitting fish plates to the rails without completely removing sleepers, which would then need to be replaced somehow to produce a decent looking result. The fish plates are still difficult to get on, and I find I need to use pliers, taking care not to crush the fish plates or they won't fit onto the other piece of track. After I'd done a couple of pieces of track for this layout, I realized that I was burning my cutting board with the hot knife, so I switched to doing the cutting on a piece of wood. I laid flex track out from the Hornby station for the outside line with the intention of connecting with the outer curve on the corner, 4th radius. I put a buffer on the end in the station and laid the track in as reasonable a position as possible with the Hornby platform spacing. Here's the first join in the tracks coming out of the station. 2 full lengths of flex track brought me close to the curve on the corner. On the other side of the curve, that track needed to be brought round to line up with the track from the other station. This seemed basically feasible with just a little deviation in the mainly straight sections of the track. However, I was rather missing the point and oversimplifying things. My plan called for crossovers to allow trains to switch tracks after they came out of the station. So points would need to be installed, and I was planning to motorize these points, as having to change them manually would be awkward. So the tentative track laying I'd done so far wasn't really much use. I needed to fit the points in. Initially, I tentatively looked at placing the crossovers like this, immediately outside the stations. I also wanted another point to allow branching onto the 3rd partial line just before the corner. The problem with putting the crossovers just outside the stations would be that only a short train would be able to use the crossover, since the front of a longer train would already be past the start of the crossover. I basically wanted to be able to pull a 3-coach train into the station and then have a new loco hook up to the back of that train, pull it out and take the crossover. For this to be possible, the distance between the buffers in the station and the start of the crossover would need to be greater than the length of 3 coaches and 2 locos, a little over 4 feet. I set up these locos and coaches on the shelf to establish this length. The result of this was that the crossovers were going to need to be quite far along towards the corner. There's never enough room for things on model layouts. The crossover on the other side would also need to be well outside the station, about level with the side of the window. So a bunch more track cutting was required to provide pieces to connect with the crossovers in their intended positions. This is how I cut my flex track, using a fibre cutting disc on a rotary tool. I tried to cut the rails as neatly as possible, then finished by cutting the underlying web with a knife. With newly cut pieces of flex track, I got the points into place for the crossover outside the Hornby station, for the crossover outside the other station by the window, and for the track branch, so I pretty much had my points where they needed to be. But pretty much wasn't really going to be good enough, as I wanted to motorize these points, so I needed to mount point motors under them, and to do that I was going to need to make pits in my foam shelving. So I needed to be pretty sure about where I wanted my points, as once they had motors mounted in pits under them, moving them was going to be very awkward. I had bought Pico set track points and Pico point motors, on the presumption that these would work properly together, being from the same maker. I was intending to mount the motors directly to the points themselves, as this arrangement worked best with my foam shelving, but this did mean that quite large pits needed to be opened up under the points for the motors to fit into. I brought up my heated foam cutter to help with the process. I actually cut the first pit with knives, but that was terribly messy since the foam tended to shred into lots of little bits, so I switched to using the heated cutter for the rest of the operations, and this was much tidier as it cut through the foam without shredding it. In addition to the rectangular pits for the point motors, I've also made small holes right through both layers of shelving to run wiring for the point motors and for power feeds to the track. Here are the pits for the point motors for the crossover and 2 additional holes for power feeds. And here's the pit for the motor for the track branch point. I fixed the motors to the points, which is done by pushing the tabs on the ends of the motors through the little holes in the sleepers of the point. Then I soldered wires to the motors, a common line to both connections on one side and separate lines for switching to the connections on the other side. I connected this wiring up to the CDU, capacitor discharge unit, connections on my Morley controller to test the point motors before installing them on the board. The red wire is for the common side, and it comes directly from the CDU to both connections on one side of the point motor. The black wire is a double wire making 2 separate connections to the other side of the point motor. The other ends of these 2 wires are connected to the tabs on either side of a Pico passing contact switch installed in a Pico frame. The center tab of the passing contact switch is then connected to the other side of the CDU. When the Morley controller is powered on and the CDU charged, flipping the passing contact switch causes the motor to flip the point. I'd bought used Pico point motors from British model trains. Nigel said that he had checked them all, but then I might always have damaged them with my own work, soldering, etc., so I was suitably relieved when the motors actually worked when I tested them, the 3 that I've done so far. Having tested the motor, I wanted to install it in the board. I passed the wiring down through the shelf so that I could later bring it round underneath and connect it up. Unfortunately, I managed to mess up. I guess that I didn't mark the positions for both motors of the crossover with the tracks properly connected up, so things had shifted when I marked the second position, and now I had points installed that wouldn't join up. Bah! I had no choice, of course, but to move one of the points over, as they were totally useless if they didn't join up. I used my hot cutter to cut a square of foam out of the shelf, moved the point over and reinserted the cut-out square on the other side of the point motor, albeit rather messily as the hot cutter removes quite a bit of material as it cuts. At this point I finally had 3 points installed with their motors and the wires passed through the shelving, but just dangling at the moment. I also made 2 power feeds by soldering the ends of wires to fish plates which were then used to join the 2 tracks by the window. Those will be the primary power feeds. Initially they will feed power to the whole of the tracks, but eventually end sections will need to be isolated to allow the shuttle control units to operate, and then those isolated sections will need to have their own separate power feeds. If you look carefully here, you'll see that there are 3 pairs of wires from the points, red for the common side, which will connect to a common bus that I'll run round, and black wires which are actually double for operating the point motors. In addition to the 3 pairs of wires from the points, you can see 1 additional black wire dangling. That is another double wire for one of the power feeds. The wire for the other power feed is not dangling because I've already run it round under the shelf. I've just threaded it round through the brackets that are supporting the shelf. I think this should be okay. That double wire goes all the way to the end under the Hornby station. Eventually there'll be a control panel for the points, shuttles, switchable power feeds, etc. I haven't quite figured that out, but I think it will be mounted to the wall under the Hornby station somehow. But for now, I just connected the ends of this power feed wire to the Track 3 connectors on my Morley Vortrack controller so that I can run a test loco on that outer track, which should now work all the way from one station to the other. So let's have a look at that initial testing. This is as far as I've got so far. I still need to install the motors for the points of the other crossover, which is going to be a tough job given their awkward position behind my existing Hornby layout. Then I'll need to fill in the rest of the track for the inner line and the partial branch line. Then I'll have a working layout, but still with no isolated sections or shuttle control. And of course all the wiring needs to be threaded and the control panel built and mounted. One step at a time. But here at least is a first run. Okay, sort of exciting moment. First train actually running on my shelf layout. I mean, I know we had the test track, but that wasn't the layout itself. Well, I say train, I'm just running a loco light engine at the moment, little black Bachmann Ginty. I think this one's a Bachmann. Let's try and not ram him into the buffers there. I'm using the handheld, whoops, I can't talk about the zoom on this one. The zoom on this thing is just the devil to operate. The toggle switch on it is just annoying on the zoom on this camera. And I can't really use the remote of the camera because I'm operating the train with a remote in my other hand. But anyway, still a lot of construction mess there. Only the outer track is continuous at the moment. And the excitement is somewhat tempered by the fact I've still got some very nasty construction work to do. These points here, I haven't installed the point motors for them, and that's going to be a nasty job. Come on, they're not in an easy place to get to. They're right at the back. I had enough trouble installing the point motors and the wiring for the points over there, where they were in a place where I could really get at them very easily, because I could walk right up to the shelf there. Now I've got to install, I've got to, take those points out, so this track's going to get disconnected again. And these points I'm talking about here for that crossover, I've got to take them, disconnect them. I need to mark where the motors need to go before I disconnect them so I don't make the same mistake I made on the others and get the motors misaligned. Then mark them, disconnect them, cut the holes in the board, mount and solder the motors. Not a very pleasant job. Now there'll be more work to do after that, but I haven't even started dealing with the issue of creating isolated sections with separate power at the ends for the shuttle yet. That's another whole different thing. I'm just going to get the layout working without the shuttle first and then do the shuttle installation afterwards. Still, at least some progress has been made. We have seen an engine actually run on the layout now, so
And then I just have to grit my teeth and get on with the rest of that work with the points.